Well, thank you and welcome everybody. I want to start out with an apology. We decided to do this event on yet another slow news day. Nothing going on. So I'm sure that Professor Meacham and I will struggle in figuring out what to talk about. But let me first just do a brief introduction. First of all, I'm John Geer. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Science, and importantly, the Ginny and Searcy Dean, and that's a title that I hold with true respect and honor. And Professor Meacham is the Carolyn T. Robert M. Rogers Chair in the American Presidency. And again, I know that John is very grateful for the Rogers for that honor. So we know that things are unfolding probably during the course of this hour. Some things will unfold that you might want to let us know about so that we could comment on. But what I thought we'd do, and John and I have talked a little bit about this, is to kind of give a sense of where the state of the race is right now. Maybe in some ways take a bit of a breath as we try to deal with all the actions and inactions in ways that are going on. And so I just want to present some data. This isn't any commentary on it, but just where things stand empirically at this moment. Obviously, we're about 4 weeks out from the election. Voting has already started in a lot of states. In fact, my colleague Josh Clinton reports that the number of votes that have been submitted via the mail in Pennsylvania record-setting, and about 75% of them are from registered Democrats. Those votes won't be counted actually until after Election Day. And so votes are rolling in lots of ways. So the election started. We have both the campaign and the election. At this moment, the approval of President Trump stands at about 44%. If you average all the polls, it's varied over the last 6 months, anywhere from 42 to 47%. For re-election, you usually need to be about 48, 49, and above 50 if you want to be comfortably re-elected, at least traditionally. Nationally, the polls stand at nearly a 10 percentage point lead for Vice President Biden. The polls that have been conducted in October have given Biden leads of 16, 10, 8, 12, 10, 12, 9, and 10. And these are the ones that have been conducted from October 1st since. So again, the lead's about 10, as I just said. In the battleground states, Biden leads by about 5 points. And that's, again, consistent. The polls aren't just showing a 5% support gained by Biden, but they're consistently in his favor. Might be 2 points, might be 7, might be 5, but very rarely is Trump leading in these key battlegrounds. It looks like since the debate last week between Biden and Trump, Biden's lead's edged up by about a point or two. It's expanded a little bit. In general, the polls have been tremendously stable. There's kind of two conversations going on. One is the news media's conversation that goes on, and it's obviously ideological and partisan in lots of ways, but the polls themselves have been pretty stable. The number of undecideds are very low by comparison to what was going on in 2016, for example. And as of today, the Cook Political Report, which is a highly respected outlet, has Biden at 290 electoral votes, and he only needs 270. There's 85 toss-up states with 85 electoral votes, and then 163 states that are in Trump's corner with those electoral votes. And what you'll see structurally is that Biden's ahead, Trump's behind. And what Biden wants to do is to keep the election on the theme of the virus and keep it going in that way. And he doesn't really want to see change. Trump's looking for something to change the narrative. And so he will consistently be throwing things out there to try to change the narrative. And that's not just because he's Donald Trump. That's what happens when you're behind. You've got to find some sort of wedge. So that this is not just, it can be interpreted just as as Trump's behavior. It's in fact what people do when they're behind. They try to find some wedge issue. And so he is in need of that, and he needs to change the conversation. He will look forward to doing that. The final thing I want to make a comment to, and I want to turn it over to my friend John Meacham, is that one of the things I've noticed, and this is a qualitative feel, and it's not one driven by partisanship, is that Biden's become comfortable with his message of late. I watched him in the town hall that he held in Florida. He seemed to be comfortable. I thought the Gettysburg speech that he delivered was again one that he was comfortable with the message, that he's in some sense hitting his stride. Now that, of course, comes with being in the lead. You may be just a little bit more comfortable, but there's a real need for candidates to believe in what they're saying because it just becomes more genuine. And I've detected this shift, and it may not be real, but I wanted to get Professor Meacham's thoughts about that, and then turn it over to him for some assessments of what's going on. And then he and I will go back and forth for basically another 25 minutes. And then we'll start taking questions that have been both pre-submitted and the ones that come in during the course of this gathering. So, John, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you. And as you all know, we refer to Dean Geer as Dean Geer. We don't want him getting too big ahead. It's a difficult struggle, but his colleagues, I want you all to be reassured that his colleagues are doing all we can to manage him. I know from conversations over the weekend that John's point about Vice President Biden is right on. He is interestingly more comfortable with a governing stance than even a campaigning one. And when you think about his biographical arc, that makes sense, right? He ran 2 national campaigns, but they were both brief in 1987, 88, and in 2007, 2008. Then being vice president, your job, right? To some extent, the job is to be partisan and be out there. But the way Obama and Biden divided the work of the White House, Biden spent 8 years with kind of a whole field view. And so I think that is a comfort zone for him. I think that, as John says, there's nothing more confidence inspiring than to be ahead. And so I know from conversations that he's very much hoping that he can spend the next 3.5 weeks talking about the country and not about Trump. And that will, just given the nature of the president, I think be annoying in a way for Trump that might have a partisan effect as well. Again, this isn't a partisan point, it's just, as John says, the messaging, the way they're using the candidate is, given that the fray is so chaotic and there are so few undecided voters, and we can talk about those numbers, Biden's basic view is he should play the role that has gotten him this far. You know, dance with the one that brung you, and the one that brung you was that he's a figure of stability in fundamentally an unstable time. And maybe the country will accept that, maybe they won't, but that's clearly the political dynamic of the moment. You know, historically, Octobers are chaotic. Elections turn in October. I can think of 2 in particular. One in 1980, Reagan and Carter headed into their only debate in Cleveland on Tuesday, October 28th, 1980, 7 days out from the election. Imagine that, 7 days out from the election. And they were about even heading in. And what the country wanted was, to some extent, I think, to make sure that Ronald Reagan wasn't, as he himself put it, a combination of the Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge. And the takeaway from that debate with President Carter was, you know what, he doesn't seem crazy. And the numbers began to break. By the weekend, it was a double-digit number. And President Carter ends up, as you may remember, conceding before the polls closed in the West on Tuesday, November 4th. That was a late October shift. And of course, 2016, 2000, actually 3 examples. 2000, George W. Bush looked pretty good, close, but had an edge heading into that last weekend. And that's when a Fox affiliate in Maine went national with the story of a DUI that he'd had in Ginny back in his early 30s. And as he will tell you, we had Karl Rove come speak to our class, a week ago, right, John?
Yep.
And Karl absolutely believes that they lost the popular vote because a number of evangelicals, charismatic, very conservative, culturally conservative people suddenly thought, wait a minute, Bush isn't what he appears to be. He's just another undisciplined baby boomer. You know, he didn't level with us. And Bush will tell you that that was a massive mistake on his part. That was 5 days out from the election. I think it broke on the Thursday night before the Tuesday election. And then 2016, heading into that last weekend in October, it looked as though Secretary Clinton was going to wrap this up. And that's when James Comey came out and said he was looking at the investigation into the emails, which are still being discussed by the President of the United States today. So these things, there's a lot that can happen. History tells us, right? This isn't just dork ESPN analysis. History tells us that the last 3 weeks, sometimes the last 3 or 4 days, matter enormously. And it's just simply a clinical observation that this president, I think, will reach for anything he possibly can to shake up that dynamic going forward. So this is a fascinating 3 weeks we have ahead. And then there's the post-election scenario, which we can talk about as much as y'all want. It's very confusing. The Constitution is not particularly clear. You add the 12th Amendment to the 20th Amendment, and you still don't get a very clear picture of what happens if the Electoral College has competing slates of electors, if one of the candidates is disputing the count, and if that blows past the Electoral College deadline, at what point does the race, as the Constitution says, go to the House? The House shall choose is the constitutional language, but it's very murky about how that would happen. Goes back to 1876, the Hayes-Tilden battle then, and there was a law passed in an attempt to adjudicate between, if a state were to send 2 sets of electors to Washington, pledged to different candidates, how do you decide which to seat? And the law is very murky on this. It's not impossible, and this is not alarmist, it's just an observation. It's not impossible that we get to January and we don't have a president who's conceded, even if he has lost the popular vote. And if the traditionally, conventionally chosen electors are seated. There are many, many Democrats right now, and I know this firsthand, who are wargaming scenarios where Republican governors and Republican legislatures might send competing electors to the Electoral College, even if Biden wins their state. And that's really the nightmare scenario, because there's not a clear mechanism to deciding which set of electors, which of their votes would be counted. The other little detail, which is not so little, is if the House stays the way it is today, in terms of the balance, roughly the balance of power, Donald Trump would very likely win, even if he lost the popular vote and the Electoral College as well, if it went to the House. Because though the Democrats have a majority, they control, as things stand now, 26 out of the 50 state delegations. The Democrats control 24. The custom suggests that each state gets 1 vote. That happened in 1800, it happened in 1825. And therefore, though the Democrats have a majority, it's not unlikely that the president, if the House were not to shift that delegation balance, he could win in the House. And so I know that, and perhaps some of you have gotten these phone calls, there is a lot of energy on the Democratic side trying to put late money, late energy into House races to see if they can flip a couple of states. So long-winded way of saying, if you're like me and Dean Geer and you're here, so you probably are, this is an amazingly rich and interesting time.
Yeah, no, this is, it's a once in a lifetime election. For people who have strong partisan views, it's nerve wracking, but at the same time, the politics is absolutely fascinating. There's a temptation to focus on the structural forces, such as where the polls stand, where, the economy stands, et cetera. But we also have these ongoing conversations like about the debate. We had a VP debate last night, which I thought both candidates were fine. I can't imagine it changing the game. It seems to me that Twitter cared more about the fly on vice president's head than anything else, which probably says more about the media than it does anything else. And then this morning, of course, we wake up to the news by the Presidential Debate Commission that they're going to do this remote. Trump says he's not going to participate, but of course Trump desperately needs to participate because he needs something to change the dynamic, to change the narrative. And according to Professor Meacham, just literally before we got on, that Biden was indicating that he might not want to participate either. And this is going to be a negotiation. And we know full well that what Trump says now, he could change his mind just like any politician. So we'll have to see how all that plays out. But if indeed one side shows up, let's say Biden does end up coming and Trump doesn't, we actually have a bit of historical precedent for this from 1980, where there was a debate that Jimmy Carter refused to have John Anderson, a third-party candidate, on the stage, felt that would give Anderson too many votes. And the debate commission said all three could participate. They had certain standards, and Anderson had met them all. Carter refused to participate, and Reagan and John Anderson, who's from Illinois, had a debate among themselves, and there was an empty chair for President Carter, and he didn't show up. And so sometimes candidates have held their ground, and they just haven't. I think in the end, we don't know where this will end. I think part of it is also going to be just simply the health protocols, because part of the reason why the debate commission issued this judgment is it's not clear where President Trump will stand in the situation he faces with the virus. The amount of information that's been released isn't very rich in detail, and so there's some concern, and rightly so. We had plexiglass up last night as a modest effort to provide more safety and for the two candidates. We'll see how it stands up. But what does your crystal ball tell you, John, about what's going to happen on the second debate? Obviously, it's total guesswork, but I can't imagine they don't have it in some way, shape, or form, because Trump really wants it and Biden can't afford to ignore it.
Yeah, I think it feels as though we're in the midst of a great tactical struggle here. Biden's campaign clearly made the decision to take his phone call. I think he was talking to Maria Bartiromo this morning and said he wasn't going to do it. The Biden people have taken him at his word. And so therefore it forces the president's camp back to saying, okay, we didn't mean it. We really want to have it. And then, so it looks as though Trump is more desperate for the debate. And all Biden has to say is, the president told me said he didn't want to go, so I took him at his word. You never can believe him, can you? Right? I mean, you don't have to be Karl Rove to figure out how to message this. But a lot of what I just said is like a lot of what John and I and our colleagues have been doing with this class we have this semester. It's a kind of analog analysis, right? It presumes the world and the infrastructure of elections and politics is recognizable and amenable to historical analysis. And we're just in a period where the vice presidential debate, I think, to me, the big takeaway was that was a debate you could have seen at any point in the modern era, right? I mean, they talked past each other. They didn't answer the questions. Susan Page is a friend of mine. I felt sorry for her having to deal with that. And it was frustrating. In some ways, actually, I haven't had a chance to blow this past John, but to some extent, the vice presidential debate revealed partly why Trump is president, right? Because it was not an illuminating exchange. And so people who want politicians to address reality, there are ironies within ironies here, who were just tired to death of these, I shouldn't use that phrase in the COVID era, who were very tired of these politicians who were mechanical, driven by talking points, ignored the questions, said what they wanted to say, and didn't address genuine concerns. That's partly the gasoline on the floor that gives you populist fires, right? I remember early on in one of the early coronavirus task force meetings, there was a inadvertently revealing moment where Pence gets up and gives an answer that was not an answer. And you should go back and look at it. And Trump actually says, you can tell this guy has been doing this for a long time because he didn't come anywhere near answering your question. And of course, one of the misfortunes and mysteries of this era, of this president, is he had, and I use the past tense advisedly because he doesn't anymore, but when he came in, he had the opportunity to channel his unconventionality in a very productive way, right? I mean, he was not really bound to anybody, not bound to traditional parties. Nixon went to China, Reagan does the Cold War. Great presidents challenge the assumptions of their base and do surprising things. And this president's done surprising things, but none of them have been about challenging his base. And so I think I had this twitch in the middle of the debate last night thinking, this is politics as normal by and large, and there's a reason people responded to somebody who, to use a very technical political science term, kind of called bullshit on the analog world. Now, what happened, of course, is he had his own reality. He didn't bring the voters' reality, broadly put, to the sphere. And so he created his own. So that's the complexity in this. But when we think about this period, I think one of the great missed opportunities is that we got an unconventional president. There's big stuff that needs to be done on infrastructure and entitlements, and there's stuff guns that needs to really break down the orthodoxies of right and left. And this president had the capacity, presumably the theoretical capacity to do that, and yet has governed in the way he's governed. And that may sound partisan to you all. I don't think it is. I think that's a clinical observation.
I think that's right. I mean, we know that Nixon going to China, why could he do that? Why was it unconventional? It was unconventional, but why could he do it? He had the credibility. He was the absolute anti-communist. And so we couldn't have had, George McGovern could have been elected president. He could never have done that because he didn't have the credibility on it. So, what is it, as we think about this election, I mean, obviously there's thousands of scenarios that can unfold. My personal view, and I want you to react to this, John, again, I haven't blown this idea by you, is that, first of all, we have to focus on the Electoral College, but it's also true that the national vote drives, in some sense, the college. So, for example, on election night, if Florida falls to Biden, and Florida's votes will be counted before, we'll have those data on election day because they have a different process than Pennsylvania. And that's true also for North Carolina. So we'll likely know the outcome of the Florida vote. It may be really close and therefore they won't be able to decide it right away. But if in fact Biden wins and he's ahead in the popular vote by 4 points, whatever, or maybe even more, but the college isn't yet settled, I don't see how Trump spins his way out of that one. That is that you've got this vote that's dramatic. You've got Florida where there's just really no scenario that he can win the college without Florida. And so there may be some states that haven't been counted, but the facts that you had a 2-point lead by Clinton in 2016, if you get double that lead, that's going to bring a whole bunch of additional states into the Democratic camp, even if in fact they haven't been officially counted, that you just have the moral high ground. Now, and that really would help the narrative. And I base that on the fact that if you go back to 2000 and the Florida recount, the thing that probably drove that was that Bush did have a 537 vote lead. That if in fact Gore had had a 537 vote lead, that it would have been much a different kind of outcome. And so I just think there's a certain point where the legitimacy is just going to come into play. Now that's maybe I'm too optimistic about that. But if we have, you know, if it's a 10-point gap on election day nationally, and then I just don't see how I mean, Trump could decide that it's still crooked, but I don't see how that's going to play, and I don't see how Republicans actually would join Trump. He'd be out there by himself. And I don't know what the cutoff point is, but anything over 5 is going to be very hard for Trump to respond to. But again, we haven't discussed this, so feel free to disagree.
I hope you're right, but if I had $1 for every sentence that began, I don't see how
That's true.
over the last 5 years, it would be a different thing. I think that's right. And I think that given the structural partisanship, a 53% victory or 54 would be like Johnson and Nixon, 64 and 72 and Reagan in 84, because we're just more partisan. So it's kind of it's almost like a handicap system. It would be like a 60-point victory. What I can't tell is if he sows chaos in the sense of these were fake ballots. Of course he ran up these big numbers because the Democrats have been lying and making this up and et cetera, et cetera. I think it's as Donald Rumsfeld would say, it's a known unknown. I think you're right. I hope you're right. Let me put it that way. And my gut tells me you're right, but I have a significant twitch that we just don't know. And all he needs is 2 or 3 states with Republican legislatures and Republican governors who also might have been blown out in their own races. That's another force here, right? Mm. So you're talking about a Congress where, let's say this is a Democratic tsunami. That means you've got lame duck sessions where you've got a lot of really angry people. And also it becomes in their interest politically to say that the votes against them were fake, right? So I just think there's level within level here. What do you think Lindsey Graham is going to say? If Lindsey loses, and that's going to be a close race no matter what, let's say he loses by a percentage point. It's in his interest to say that it was stolen in, Jim Clyburn's district, right? And what's that going to mean, given Jamie Harrison, right? So maybe this is an early night. Maybe it's like 1920. I wanted to give you all, because I really consider my role at Vanderbilt to arm you with dork things to tell other people. It used to be, sort of for water coolers. We don't have water coolers anymore, but here's one. Of all the analogies that people like me throw out, one that hasn't gotten much attention is 1920, exactly 100 years ago. So a couple of things. Huge new voting bloc, women, right? 19th Amendment is ratified. 1920 is the first federal election women can vote in. We're coming out of a pandemic. 675,000 Americans died in 1918 and 1919. We had a president who was sick and wasn't particularly transparent about it. Okay, we're checking 3 boxes now, right? It was a blowout for the Republicans. it was Cox and Franklin Roosevelt were the Democratic nominees, and they carried, I think, maybe 8 or 9 states. That's not impossible. I don't think it could be that big structurally, but you're right, John. I mean, if Biden is rolling up 5, 7, 8 percentage point leads, it gets harder. And then Trump does become more of a, King Lear on the heath, right? Raging. I suspect this is the first time in Donald Trump's life he's been compared to King Lear. So he'd like it because of the king part. But, I feel oddly talking in this way because it sounds as though I'm rooting for a particular result. I just think that one of the issues we have to wrestle with in the country is, were the forces of the Trump years forces we want to continue to have flow through the body politic? Do you want a politics that occupies this much of your mind share? Do you want a politics that is this reflexively contentious and, to borrow a phrase from the president, maybe he doesn't want the virus to dominate our lives, but he sure wants to, at least in terms of attention and oxygen. And so that's an unfortunate thing too. Sorry, I don't mean to use that. So I just think that there's a lot on the ballot here. I have a theory. We obviously are in a very red state. I have a theory that particularly for women, that whereas there was a hidden Trump vote in 2016, I think there's a hidden Biden vote. I think there are a lot of folks who may not tell anybody what they're doing on both sides. But my gut is that a lot of people are going to go in and they know that if they're at a certain level of wealth, they know they're going to be paying more money, right? I mean, taxes are going up for very well-off people. If those very well-off people were voting entirely on self-economic interests, they would vote for the president. I think there are going to be a lot of people who say, you know what, I'm tired of this show. That's how Joe McCarthy fell from power. People got tired of the show and wanted to change the channel. And maybe I'm wrong, and we'll find out soon enough. But my sense is that structurally, it's hard to see how the president does this. But we would have said the exact same thing on this date in October in 2016. Yeah.
So let me play off. We're going to now turn to questions that were pre-submitted for a minute. But there's actually one question I want to follow up that is a perfect segue to your last set of comments. Obviously, there's been lots of conversations about polarization and how polarized we are, and that's an obsession in a lot of different ways because it is driving our politics.
Yeah.
But can you come up with any historical example where the public at a certain point did get exhausted with the role that politics started to play in their lives, and they wanted it just to be calmer? And so provide some, not from a partisan, it's obviously partisan, but think of that as what kind of historical comparisons can we have where the public just wanted to take a deep breath, and that deep breath would be voting for Joe Biden as opposed to Trump because he's the chaos candidate and Biden is the calm candidate, if you will. Give us some examples. You mentioned 1920 with the virus. 20 strikes me as one potential possibility. McCarthy, though it wasn't at the presidential level, is another, but pull out your historical bag of tricks here, my friend.
Yeah, 1920 is the best one because remember, Harding, the Republican message was return to normalcy because we'd come through the war, we'd come through the pandemic, we'd come through a serious crackdown on civil liberties because of the Red Scare. Media was changing. The 1920 census was the first point at which more Americans lived in cities than on farms. Radio becomes widely commercially available in 21. So there's a national culture developing. Industrialization has clearly taken root. We see that more as the early 20th century, but 20 was where it kind of settled in. And so the analogy here would be globalization, right? That the effects of it, which we've been anticipating for 20 years, have now clearly become part of our lives. I think that's a great example. You know, there are crises elections, 1932. This is not quite the Depression, but it's not too far from that in terms of people's faith in the future and in the institutions of those who are governing them. The other thing I think is 1980. I mean, Reagan was a revolutionary figure. He wanted a Reagan revolution. But a lot of that debate turned on a question that he borrowed from FDR in 32, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go to stores and buy things than it was 4 years ago? Is America as respected around the world as we were 4 years ago? Pretty powerful question. And I think you look at, you know, Jimmy Carter is a good and decent man. And when we look back at his presidency, many of the things he did were in the long-term interests of the country, but not in the short term, right? So I think if you look at 20, I think if you look at 32, I think if you look at 80, you see moments where the country wanted a change, right? They wanted a shift. And in this case, the shift is to a bit more order as opposed to chaos. But the chaos obviously works, right? Donald Trump hasn't changed since he won the presidency. It's one of the issues with him, right? Is there was never a moment where he decided, I'm going to use this capital and this power for a particular purpose. And, you know, that's just, we'll be writing about that forever. One of the days, this is not an election, but as John knows, one of my obsessions is finding moments where, because of coincidences, things were never the same afterward. There's an interesting one. My favorite example is June 11th, 1963. That's the day that George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door in Tuscaloosa. John Kennedy gave his civil rights speech that created what became the '64 Civil Rights Act eventually. And Medgar Evers was assassinated that night in Jackson, Mississippi. So all that happened in 24 hours. And when you think about it, that's the story in many ways of race and politics in that era. Pearl Harbor to late that week. Hitler didn't declare war on us until we declared. Hitler didn't declare war on us until late in the week. We never declared war on Hitler until he declared war on us. And so you had this 4 or 5 day period that's totally fascinating. Here's one for our era. The period between about June 16th, 2015 and June 25th, 2015. So here's what happened. Donald Trump comes down the escalator and announces his candidacy, I think on the 16th of June. 9 days later, 2 things happen. The Supreme Court rules on marriage equality. Barack Obama gives a speech about it in the Rose Garden. Obama goes to Andrews, he gets on Air Force One, he flies to Charleston and delivers that eulogy for the victims of the attack by Dylan Roof at the Emmanuel AME Church. It's the one where Obama broke into Amazing Grace. And it's a really interesting speech. And you sort of see in that 10-day period, you see a couple of different American elements clashing, some coalescing. And that's, you have an America of reaction. Roof was radicalized by the internet, by white supremacy on the internet. You have the Supreme Court trying to push the Jeffersonian understanding of equality forward. As John knows well, there's never been a shift in opinion in social science as radical and as quick as there has been generationally on marriage equality, on views of different kinds of sexual identity. It was a big issue. I mean, the journey from 2004 to where we are now is just vast. So you have these clashing forces, and to some extent, the election is which side of that divide do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the reactive side, or do you want to be on the building side? And again, that's not partisan. That's a pretty clear choice. Infinite complications within that. As Vice President Biden's been saying, you don't have to agree with me on everything or even on most things to think that the body politic might benefit from a different path. And that's an interesting message. I don't know if it'll win, but when we look back at this, it may be that of those Democratic candidates, Biden was the one who could do this. Because, let's just be blunt, Senator Warren would be seen as too liberal. Senator Harris is a woman of color. Mayor Buttigieg, is the country ready for a married gay man? I don't know. The Democratic Party wasn't. It may be that this 76-year-old white guy was the important transitional figure. And because he's a 76-year-old white guy from Delaware, he was the one who could begin to marshal these forces and be a kind of a transitional figure. And I think Biden is that. I think that ultimately is how we'll look back on it.
So let me just take one more question that was pre-submitted, and I think it's a good question. I think I can handle it pretty quickly. If somebody's asked, why aren't the attacks on Biden working? And obviously one could say that has a partisan flavor to it, but I think it raises an important issue about when attacks work and when they don't. So let's go back to 1980. The Carter campaign had spent most of their energy raising doubts about Reagan's credibility as a candidate, that he was a warmonger. What was it, Scrooge, and what was the other term you used, John? It was
Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge.
Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge. That was a key message of the Carter campaign. And during that debate, which was held very late in the campaign, Reagan didn't appear to be either. Now, if Reagan during the course of that debate had shown himself to be a potential Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge, Carter might well have won. But the whole premise of that campaign went away. And so part of the attacks that have gone on by Trump against Biden, one, for example, is that he's not up to the task. He's too old. He's senile, whatever terms you want to use, Sleepy Joe. Well, the problem is that Sleepy Joe has just not been that sleepy. That his performance in the debate was totally fine. His acceptance speech was fine. He's been doing a credible job, undermining the credibility of that argument. Or like this morning, again, Trump decides to attack Kamala Harris as a communist. She's not a communist. It just doesn't work. Attacks have to have some sort of credibility. And so part of the problem with the first debate for Trump was that he, in some sense, fed the narrative that the Biden campaign had been saying that Trump really wasn't competent to be president because he was all over the map, and that he's just not somebody who's going to unify the country. And he's demonstrated that in the debate. So I think attacks in and of themselves work when they hook into something that's credible. And as Biden said on, I think it was Tuesday night, somebody was asking about whether he was too beholden to the left. You know, you guys know me. I'm no liberal. In fact, I get attacked by liberals because I'm not progressive enough. So the role of attacks are powerful. They're important. We absolutely need them. We need to raise doubts about the opposition, but they have to have credibility. And without credibility, they just don't work. So we've been getting lots of great questions, by the way, from all of you, and you're now 1,500 strong, apparently, we were told, which is great. And I want to ask, one of the things that, John, I want to ask you a question that's come up. A bunch of our friends out there in the audience are interested in polling. And I could give some sort of technical answer about polls, et cetera, whether they're good or bad. And I think that's kind of boring. What is your sense of both your views about the validity and value of polls this campaign, and what also your fellow, commentators in the news media, how do they treat polls? How do they think about polls in light of 16, also in light of 18, because polls were pretty accurate then. What, how are they part of the conversations that are being played in by those who are analyzing elections? So we're not talking about a technical answer, but just, what.
Yeah. I remember Bob Dole saying, I heard him say once, I don't believe any polls unless I'm ahead, So the cultural role they play is what you're asking. It's a great question. I think they tend to affirm pre-existing biases. You can, because if you're just talking as opposed to basing things on data, you can always find some historical analogy for a comeback or somebody who kept a lead, right? So the difference here, and again, if you all are really in deep dork mode, the exit polls, which are, what's that group called, John? Are they in Wisconsin? The National Survey.
Oh, you mean the American National Election Studies? No.
Yeah. But stuff. Exit polls I find fascinating because at that point, I don't see why people aren't telling the truth. And so, but that's my historical bias. I want to know why they did what they did, as opposed to predicting what they're going to do. And so I'm a little different in that. One of the things that, forgive me if I did this in our last conversation, but one of my pieces of evidence for this structural partisanship idea is that in 1964, 40% of Republicans voted for Lyndon Johnson, right? 1972, 40% of Democrats voted for Richard Nixon. By 2000, 9% of Democrats voted for George W. Bush. In 2008, 13% of Republicans voted for Barack Obama. And now it's about 1 and 1. To me, the number I'm watching for out of the exit polls in a month is how many self-identified Republicans would tell a pollster they had crossed the aisle. Because to me, that's a great measurement of bipartisanship. Because why would you say it if it weren't true? If you want to say people wanted to say they voted for the black guy in 2008, okay, but not 13%, right? I'll give you 3 points, right? So I'll say from 2000 to 2008, 10% of the other party was in play. What I'm fascinated by is what percentage in this era of self-identified Republicans are open to crossing the aisle and then willing to say so because they're in-person polls.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you this, Jeff. So have you noted any difference in online polling versus speaking polling? Is there any kind of honesty gap? Do we know anything yet?
We know a little bit. The future of polling more broadly is going to be online. There's still some people who don't necessarily trust online polls, but they actually are pretty accurate if they're done right. The problem, polls are powerful techniques, but you have to have if they're done right. And the if they're done right is hard work. And so it doesn't matter what kind of poll you have, whether it be in person, the automated voice, or you have something that's online, or mail-in. There's even, you could do mail-in polls. They're not very accurate, but all of those results have to be weighted because the people who respond to polls are different than people who don't. And you've got to figure out what the right weighting strategy is. And that's the real complication. And that's what makes the polls in this particular election so fascinating, because most pollsters are assuming that the 2020 electorate's going to look a lot like 2016. And what that means is that's a pretty Republican electorate. That's a pretty Trump electorate, pretty much a Trump electorate. So our colleague Josh Clinton actually systematically analyzed a poll from North Carolina that showed Biden up by 2 points, I believe, right, using a particular weighting scheme. And if instead you decide that the electorate in 2020 is going to look like what happened in 12, which means a lot more African-American turnout, that in fact Biden's lead goes to 5. If you assume it's like what looked like in 2008, which was a banner year for black turnout because of the first nomination of a major party candidate who was African American, Biden's lead jumps to 9 points. And if you assume it's an electorate like 2010, which was a big Republican year, Trump's actually ahead. So choose your poisons. And the problem is most pollsters are like generals. They fight the last battle again. And so that means that their weighting assumptions tend to be 2016. Is that true? Is there a secret Biden vote out there because it's so partisan? Let's say there's a woman living in suburbia somewhere, long Republicans, and she's not going to tell her husband that she's going to vote for Biden.
Yeah.
And that's very possible. In fact, one of the questions that was submitted is, a lot of people in polls won't admit that they support Trump. That's actually not the problem with the Trump supporters. It's that they don't want to take the polls at all. They're so anti-establishment that they just won't even do a poll. And that's what happened in 2016, especially in those Rust Belt states, is that they weren't considering the possibility enough that the people who weren't taking the polls were far more white working class and Trump supporters. And therefore these polls all painted too far of a blue picture when in fact it was far, far redder. And that led Clinton to make a lot of bad decisions. And so most of the efforts of in 2020 have been to correct that, but they're correcting it based on what they learned from the last election. And that's not, who knows if that's exactly true, but 2018 was pretty accurate. And so, I think that there's reasons to believe that the polls are accurate. I'd be really surprised if, there's no way Biden has a 16-point lead nationally. There was one poll that had him out of 16. There's just no way. I mean, if that's the case, then people are much more malleable than we think, and we just don't have any data for that. At the same time, if there's some poll that comes up that all of a sudden shows them with only a 2-point lead, I don't buy that either. And so you really, and the different weighting assumptions are just all over the map. And so when you get a result of a poll that doesn't make any sense to you, and all of you are pretty engaged and informed about politics, it probably means it doesn't make any sense. The intuition about these things really matters. You need to have some feel for it. So if you go back to 2016, while Hillary Clinton was following the data, you had her husband, former President Clinton, saying, these are wrong. There's no way this is right. There's a lot more support for Trump in these rural areas. We've got to get out there. We've got to retool things. And he was ignored. But he didn't have the data. He just had this kind of contextual feel. And it's one of the things that I would say, one of the things we're trying to teach our class, for example, is not just to automatically just digest the data and treat them as facts, but assess them contextually, assess them with some doubt. Keep in mind the context. We had a great visitor from Pennsylvania, a woman named Abby Murphy, who worked for Connor Lamb, who ran a very visible special election campaign and overturned a Trump plus 20 district to, in fact, the Democrats. And she talked about the basic feel of politics and how she did not appreciate how deep the dislike of Hillary Clinton was. And that she remembers very deeply that people who were in their 50s and their 60s never forgot that Hillary Clinton made these comments about, what do you expect me to stay home and bake cookies? That irritated a whole generation of women who in fact were dedicated to their families. And yes, they were going to stay home and do some baking. And they thought that was totally legitimate. And Hillary Clinton was attacking that. And that had stayed there. That doesn't come up in a poll, but it does come. And that's why you have to have this feel. And so that's why people have their doubts about polls, but it's because they're interpreting them in an automated fashion. No, that's not the right word. Automatic fashion.
The dean is older.
Yeah, and getting older every day, by the way, just for the record.
Yeah, we help them along, yeah.
But, and I think we need to have that contextual feel. So here's a very simple question for you, John, which I think is a good one. You may have some additional insights into this. Is Texas in play in this election? And if so, why?
So I just spent a couple of days in Texas with a former very senior Republican elected official in the federal government. And it is, in his view, Texas could be in play because of the Latino vote. And it's a state that's big and complicated, like Florida, more complicated than we tend to think. And so let's put it this way. If he's right, and if Texas is in play, then it's probably, again, analog analysis, but then it probably means it might not be a particularly long night. But I'm very moved by what John says about there could be a significant number of people who want the president to continue. They don't pay as much attention to the chaos, and if they do, they don't care. I think I would be much more inclined to that view absent the virus. Right? I think that we don't know and won't until we have the data of votes how the country is going to manifest its thoughts, concerns about such a fundamental force. And so to some extent, I think the election is about that, because it's about the response. It's about the deference to expertise. It's about future preference, right? Because we wear a mask not to protect ourselves, but other people. And so I think that's it's going to be a riveting and revealing vote in terms of, do people want a president who thinks that things go away, which we'd all like to do, or not?
No, I think that's right. And I do think we have to remain, if you really take democracy seriously, which I do, and assuming we have a fair count of the votes, you have to take the public's decision seriously and respect it. And, some days you're on the winning side, some days you're on the losing side, and that's just part of democratic politics. Well, we have about 2 minutes left, and I thought I'd close with just a brief comment about how amazing our students are. John and I have this class together that has been really fun. It's online. We don't have the interaction we'd like with the students, but we found other ways to do it. They have great questions. But what the Vanderbilt students are doing this semester on campus is only going to give faith for the future, because what they have done collectively is they've decided to take responsibility for their actions and do what is not fun and not what normally 20-ish-year-olds do, but they have taken their social responsibility seriously. They've been wearing masks, they've been socially distancing. Every single one of them? Absolutely not. But the vast majority are. Our infection rate's very low, and they're proud of this fact. And they get the fact that they are part of a generation that's going to have a unique stamp on it, and they are acting in ways that only make me proud. And I will also give a big plug for our faculty, because they are working really hard to make sure that this semester, despite all its hurdles, is as successful as it can be. And they're doing amazing work on that. And so I take great comfort in that, regardless of all the noise out there in Washington and across the country in the elections, that the kinds of talent that is here in our student body and in our faculty is just sign things are going to be, we're going to be fine. It's just very comforting. And to think that, I can remember how many people said, oh, the students are never going to do this. So, just tie into their competitive juices. When they heard we had a chance to beat Duke, boy, that fired them up right there. Want to make sure that, Duke's always in the rearview mirror. That's my preferred position. I'm quite comfortable with that one. But I do want to just say it is amazing. And I obviously want to extend my personal appreciation and gratitude to John for making time available, because you can imagine there's huge demands on his time. We have a class coming up in about an hour where we have a Republican ad consultant, Fred Davis, speaking to the class and talking about some recent campaigns he's run. And as a final closing note, I just want to thank each of you. Thank each of you for your engagement with the university, for your support of the university, because at this point in time, you know, we need as much support as we can get, because higher education itself is somewhat under attack, and we probably can take the word somewhat out of that. But Vanderbilt's moving forward, and we're moving forward in quite strong fashion, because we're committed not only to our educational mission, but also to our research mission. And that'll carry us through. And we have the right leaders at the helm, whether it be Susan Wente or Daniel Diermeyer. We're blessed to have that situation. And again, I want to just say thanks and give Professor Meacham here the final word, but wanted to say those few things.
That's great. And I absolutely on the students. So I want to just leave you with a quotation from one of our class visitors from a week or two ago. Speaker Pelosi kindly dropped in. And John and I, you know, we spend a lot of time, we think about these big historical forces, and he's always weighting things and talking about deltas and data. I don't understand any of it. But, you know, I deal with dead people. But so Speaker Pelosi kind of cut to the chase for our students. She said, the key thing about politics is you have to take a punch, but you have to be able to throw one. And watching an 80-year-old Italian grandmother do that with a kind of a glint in her eye, I think humanized the entire political process in a way that was a great gift to the students. And I feel very lucky to be part of this community. So thank you.
Well, thanks again to everybody, and thanks for the organizers that made this possible. And everybody be safe, be well. And we have another one in a couple of weeks, and my guess is nothing will have happened in between now and then. So stay tuned and take care. Okay, bye-bye.